The people laughing at the rusted Mustang that morning would spend the next 30 days wishing they had paid closer attention. The annual Heritage Motor Festival drew thousands of visitors to downtown Ashford every spring. Classic cars lined both sides of Main Street, chrome sparkled beneath clear blue skies. Local reporters moved through the crowd searching for stories, and dealership owners treated the event like an unofficial competition. No dealership attracted more attention than Hayes Automotive Group. At 32 years old, Victoria Hayes had built a reputation for turning everything she touched into success. Her showroom dominated the regional market, her social media following stretched across 3 states, and her opinions carried enough weight that people often repeated them as facts. When Victoria arrived that Saturday morning, cameras followed. When she spoke, people listened. A few blocks away, Ethan Walker pulled an old trailer into a parking lot beside the festival entrance. His pickup truck had over 200,000 miles on it. The trailer behind it carried what looked like little more than scrap metal. The 1967 Mustang sitting on the rusted frame barely resembled a car anymore. The paint was gone, the front fender carried years of corrosion. One headlight was missing entirely. The windshield was cracked from corner to corner. Several people stopped walking just to stare. Ethan climbed out quietly and lowered the trailer ramp. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and dressed in faded jeans and a work shirt that had seen better years. Beside him stood his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, holding a small stuffed rabbit by one ear. She looked at the Mustang with complete confidence, the kind only children possess. To her, it was not a wreck, it was simply her dad's project. Ethan guided the Mustang down the ramp while curious spectators gathered nearby. A few whispered. Others laughed openly. One man shook his head and muttered that towing the thing probably cost more than the car itself. Ethan didn't react. He focused on the Mustang. Every movement was deliberate. Every glance measured. Then Victoria Hayes noticed him. Surrounded by reporters and dealership managers, she walked toward the growing crowd. Her eyes moved over the Mustang once, before a smile appeared on her face. It was not a kind smile. "Please tell me that's not part of the festival display," she said. Several people laughed. Ethan continued checking a loose strap without looking up. Victoria stepped closer. "That thing belongs in a scrapyard, not a car show." More laughter followed. Phones appeared. Cameras turned. The crowd enjoyed the moment. Lily looked up at her father. For a second, the noise seemed to disappear. Ethan studied a section of the Mustang's frame near the driver's side door. His expression never changed. Then he smiled very slightly. Not because of what Victoria said, because he had just noticed something no one else had seen. The crowd slowly drifted away after the excitement faded, but Ethan remained beside the Mustang for another 15 minutes. He ran his fingers along the lower edge of the driver's side frame and looked at the section he had noticed earlier. Most people saw rust, most people saw damage. Ethan saw a detail that did not belong. The metal beneath the corrosion carried a subtle shape that should not have existed on a standard production Mustang. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once to himself and secured the car back onto the trailer. Lily climbed into the truck and hugged her stuffed rabbit against her chest. As Ethan started the engine, she looked through the window toward the festival. "Why were they laughing?" she asked. Ethan rested one hand on the steering wheel. "Because they only saw what was on the surface." Lily considered that answer for several seconds. "And you saw something else?" Ethan glanced toward the trailer mirror. The Mustang followed behind them. Quiet, forgotten. "Maybe," he said. Their house sat on the edge of Ashford, in a neighborhood where nobody paid much attention to old cars unless they blocked traffic. The small single-story home had peeling paint near the porch and a garage that looked older than the house itself. Ethan backed the trailer into the driveway with practiced precision. By late afternoon the Mustang sat beneath bright workshop lights while Lily colored pictures at a folding table in the corner. Ethan worked slowly. He removed damaged trim pieces and photographed every marking he found. Some parts matched factory specifications. Others did not. Several hours passed before he finally reached a section hidden beneath layers of dirt and oxidized metal. He stopped moving. His eyes narrowed slightly, a number stamped into the steel appeared almost invisible beneath decades of neglect. Ethan wiped the area clean and compared it against a reference manual resting on his workbench. The silence inside the garage grew heavier. Outside, evening settled across the neighborhood. Inside, Ethan checked the number 3 times. Then, a 4th. Lily looked up from her drawing. "Did you find something?" Ethan stared at the frame for another moment. "I found a question." That answer only made her smile. Across town, Victoria Hayes attended a networking dinner with local business leaders. The conversation eventually returned to the festival. Someone mentioned the rusty Mustang and the quiet single father who brought it there. The room laughed again. Victoria laughed with them. The story seemed finished, an amusing moment from a successful event. None of them knew that less than 10 miles away, a man sitting alone in a garage had just discovered the first clue that suggested the car was not what anyone believed it to be. And before going to bed that night, Ethan made exactly one phone call to a retired automotive historian who had not spoken publicly in nearly 6 years. The retired historian answered the phone at 9:12 the next morning. His name was Walter Grayson. For nearly 30 years he had been one of the most respected experts in American performance cars. Then he retired, disappeared from public events, and spent most of his time restoring antique tractors on a farm outside Tulsa. Ethan had met him once nearly a decade earlier. Walter listened without interrupting as Ethan described the unusual frame stamp. For several seconds after Ethan finished speaking, only silence remained on the line. Then Walter asked a single question. "Can you send me a photograph?" Ethan emailed the image immediately. 10 minutes later his phone rang again. Walter's voice sounded different now, more focused. More careful. "Where did you find that car?" Ethan looked across the garage at the Mustang sitting beneath the lights. "A private estate auction 3 months ago." Another pause followed. "Do not remove anything else until I see it." Ethan did not ask why. Walter was not a man who exaggerated. If he wanted to travel nearly 600 miles to inspect a rusted Mustang, there was a reason. 3 days later, just after sunrise, a dark pickup truck rolled into Ethan's driveway. Walter stepped out carrying a worn leather bag and a magnifying lamp. He looked older than Ethan remembered, but moved with surprising energy. The two men spent nearly 4 hours examining the car. Lily sat nearby eating apple slices while listening to conversations she barely understood. Walter inspected weld patterns. He measured body dimensions. He studied hidden markings beneath panels most people would never think to check. The deeper he looked, the quieter he became. Around noon he finally stepped back and removed his glasses. "This should not exist," he said. Ethan waited. Walter pointed toward the driver's side frame. "The stamp is authentic." Then he pointed toward a section of hand-shaped metal hidden beneath corrosion. "And so is that." Ethan folded his arms. "Authentic to what?" Walter looked directly at him. "That is the problem." He walked to his truck and returned with an old binder filled with photographs. Inside were images from Ford development facilities dating back more than 50 years. Several prototype vehicles appeared throughout the pages. Most had never entered production. Most had disappeared after testing. Then Walter stopped on one photograph. Ethan stared at it. The car looked remarkably familiar, not identical, but close enough to make his pulse slow. The wheelbase dimensions matched, the unusual body modifications matched. Even the hand-fabricated sections appeared similar. Walter closed the binder. "I am not ready to make any claims yet." Ethan nodded, but Walter looked back at the Mustang. "If I am right, there are people who would drive across the country just to see this car." Later that evening, while Ethan continued working in the garage, a message appeared on an automotive forum. It contained a single, blurry photograph of the Mustang. Within 24 hours, more than 40,000 people had viewed it. By the beginning of the second week, the photograph had spread far beyond the original forum. Automotive blogs reposted it. Collectors debated it, Amateur experts zoomed into the grainy image and argued over every visible detail. Most dismissed the entire thing as wishful thinking. Others insisted the unusual frame markings deserved a closer look. Ethan ignored all of it. Every morning he packed Lily's lunch before school. Every afternoon he worked at the repair shop, where he serviced ordinary pickup trucks, family sedans, and delivery vans. Every evening he returned to the garage and spent a few quiet hours with the Mustang. The routine never changed. What changed was the number of strangers appearing near his driveway. Some arrived with cameras, others arrived with offers. One collector from Arizona offered $20,000 without ever seeing the car in person. Ethan declined politely. 2 days later, another offer arrived. Then another. The numbers grew larger. Ethan declined those too. Across town, Victoria Hayes first noticed the growing attention during a Monday marketing meeting. One of her managers projected a local news article onto a screen. The headline mentioned the mysterious Mustang and the speculation surrounding it. Victoria leaned back in her chair and smiled. People will believe anything if it sounds interesting enough. The meeting moved on. Yet later that afternoon she searched for the story herself. Then she searched again the following day. By Friday she had read nearly every article discussing the car. She would never have admitted it publicly, but curiosity had begun replacing amusement. Meanwhile, Walter Grayson continued his investigation. He contacted former engineers. He reviewed archived manufacturing records. Most of the documents led nowhere. Then one evening he called Ethan again. "I found something." Ethan set down a wrench and listened. In 1966, Ford authorized a limited experimental development project. The records mentioned several prototype chassis. Most were destroyed. One disappeared before final documentation was completed. Ethan remained silent. Walter continued. "There are no surviving photographs of that missing chassis, at least none that I can find." Ethan looked across the garage. The Mustang sat beneath the lights, partially disassembled now. Hidden beneath decades of neglect, more unusual details continued appearing: hand-fabricated brackets, non-standard reinforcements, engineering decisions that did not belong on an ordinary production vehicle. "You think this could be that car?" Ethan asked. Walter took a long breath. "I think somebody important made sure it vanished." Later that night, Lily sat on a stool watching her father work. "Why do people keep coming here?" she asked. Ethan wiped dust from his hands. "Because they want answers." Lily nodded toward the Mustang. "Do you?" Ethan looked at the old car for several seconds before answering. "More than anybody." Outside, another vehicle slowed near the driveway. The driver remained parked across the street for nearly 5 minutes before leaving. For the first time, it was becoming clear that the mystery surrounding the Mustang was no longer staying inside the garage. Day 14 arrived with cold rain and a line of vehicles parked along Ethan Street before sunrise. Some belonged to collectors. Some belonged to journalists. A few belonged to people who simply wanted to witness the mystery for themselves. Ethan ignored the attention. The garage door remained closed. The work continued at the same steady pace it always had. Inside, the Mustang looked different now. Large sections had been carefully cleaned. Layers of corrosion had been removed. Hidden details emerged one piece at a time. None of them provided a complete answer, but together they painted a picture that grew stranger every day. Shortly after lunch, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Walter stepped out first. The second man, who emerged from the passenger side, immediately caught Ethan's attention. He appeared to be in his late 60s, dressed simply, with the calm posture of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in a room without needing to prove it. Walter introduced him as Richard Mercer, a retired engineer who had spent most of his career working on performance vehicle development programs. Richard circled the Mustang slowly. He said almost nothing during the first 20 minutes. He examined welds, he studied measurements, he inspected structural reinforcements hidden beneath the floor. Then he stopped beside the driver's side frame rail. For several seconds he simply stared. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Richard's expression had gone completely still. "What is it?" Walter asked quietly. Richard did not answer right away, he crouched lower and ran his fingertips along a section of metal that most people would never notice. Finally he stood. "I remember this." Nobody spoke. Richard looked at the car again, "Not this exact vehicle. But I remember the design." Ethan felt the room grow smaller. Richard explained that decades earlier he had briefly reviewed engineering documentation connected to an experimental development project. The program never reached production. Most employees involved signed strict confidentiality agreements. Over time, the project faded into obscurity. Many believed every prototype had been destroyed. Walter folded his arms. "How certain are you?" Richard looked directly at him. "Certain enough that I drove 6 hours to get here." The words hung in the air. Even Lily sensed their weight. She sat quietly on her stool, holding her rabbit and watching the adults. Richard opened a worn notebook from his jacket pocket. Between its pages rested an old photograph. The image had faded with age. The vehicle pictured was partially covered beneath a tarp, only part of the body was visible. Yet, the similarities were unmistakable. Ethan stared at the photograph. Walter stared at it. Neither spoke. Richard carefully returned the picture to his notebook. "If this is what I think it is," he said, "then the car itself is only half the story." Ethan looked up. "What is the other half?" Richard's answer was simple. Whoever built it never wanted the world to forget it. They just ran out of time before they could prove what it was capable of. The third week began with a level of attention Ethan had never wanted. Reporters parked at the end of the street, automotive channels posted daily updates. Speculation spread faster than facts. Some people claimed the car was priceless. Others insisted it was nothing more than a modified restoration project that had grown into an internet myth. Ethan paid little attention to any of it. Every evening after work he returned to the garage, turned on the lights, and continued uncovering the story hidden beneath layers of age and neglect. The difference now was that he was no longer working alone. Walter and Richard stayed in regular contact. Documents moved back and forth, old photographs surfaced, retired engineers made phone calls they had not made in decades, small pieces of information began connecting together. None of them revealed the full picture, but the gaps were shrinking. One Thursday afternoon, a package arrived at Ethan's house by overnight delivery. There was no return address. Inside sat a single envelope containing photocopies of engineering notes dated March 1967. Ethan spread the pages across the workbench while Walter examined them through a magnifying glass. Richard arrived 2 hours later and read every page twice. When he finished, he looked more unsettled than excited. "These are genuine," he said quietly. Ethan noticed a name repeated several times throughout the documents. It belonged to a development engineer few people remembered anymore. A man whose career ended suddenly before the project reached completion. Richard recognized the name immediately. "He was brilliant," he said. "Most people thought he was years ahead of everyone else." Lily sat nearby doing homework while the adults talked. She listened carefully even when she pretended not to. "Did he build the car?" she asked. Richard smiled. "Maybe." Lily looked toward the Mustang. "Then why did nobody remember him?" The question lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Richard finally answered. "Sometimes people build something before the world is ready to understand it." That evening another discovery emerged. Hidden beneath a section of interior paneling, Ethan uncovered a small metal plate covered by decades of dust. It had been installed where no ordinary owner would ever think to look. The plate carried a sequence of numbers, and a handwritten marking etched into the surface. Walter stared at it for nearly a full minute. Richard removed his glasses and looked again. Neither man spoke. Ethan knew that silence by now. It was the silence that appeared whenever a new piece of the puzzle confirmed something larger. Finally Walter looked up. "We are closer than I thought." Ethan folded his arms. "Closer to what?" Walter glanced toward the Mustang, and then toward the engineering documents spread across the bench. "Closer to proving that this car was never supposed to disappear." Day 29 arrived with a level of anticipation that felt almost impossible for a car nobody had cared about a month earlier. News vans lined the street before sunrise. Automotive publications from across the country requested interviews. Collectors continued calling with offers that grew larger each day. Ethan declined every one of them. The answer remained the same, not yet. Inside the garage, the investigation finally reached its conclusion. Walter arrived carrying a thick folder of documents. Richard followed an hour later, with several enlarged photographs and copies of archived engineering records. They spread everything across the workbench while Ethan listened. Lily sat nearby with her rabbit and a cup of hot chocolate. The garage felt unusually quiet. Walter opened the folder first. "We found the final link." Ethan said nothing. Walter handed him a document dated August 1967. It referenced a confidential experimental performance program that had never been publicly announced. The vehicle designation matched the numbers discovered on the hidden metal plate. Richard placed an old photograph beside the document. This time there was no uncertainty. The body structure matched. The engineering modifications matched. Even the placement of several hand-built components matched perfectly. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Richard finally said the words they had spent weeks trying to prove. "This is the surviving prototype." Ethan looked at the Mustang. The old car sat beneath the lights exactly where it had been since the day he brought it home. It looked different now. Cleaner, better understood, yet somehow it still carried the same quiet presence it always had. Walter explained that the prototype had been developed by a small engineering team attempting to create a radically different performance platform. Corporate priorities changed before the project could be completed. Funding disappeared, records were archived. The vehicle vanished. Over time, nearly everyone assumed it had been destroyed. But it had not been destroyed. It had simply been forgotten. Richard smiled softly. For nearly 60 years. Lily looked up from her stool. So everybody was wrong? Walter laughed. Almost everybody. Late that afternoon, the final report was released publicly. Within hours the story exploded across every major automotive outlet in the country. Experts who had dismissed the Mustang revised their opinions, historians confirmed the findings. Collectors begins discussing numbers that sounded unreal. Across town, Victoria Hayes sat in her office staring at the same report everyone else was reading. The photographs, the documentation, the confirmation. She remembered standing in front of that car weeks earlier. She remembered the laughter. Most of all, she remembered the quiet man, who never argued, never defended himself, and never once tried to prove anyone wrong. As the city absorbed the news, one realization spread faster than anything else. The mystery was over. The legend was real. And tomorrow, the entire city would see the car for itself. The next morning, Ashford looked different, traffic-filled streets that normally stayed quiet. Hotels reported full occupancy. Restaurants opened early to handle crowds. People traveled from neighboring states simply to witness what had become the most talked-about automotive story in the region. The city council converted part of the downtown square into a temporary exhibition area after requests from media organizations overwhelmed every available venue. By noon, thousands of people had gathered. Television crews adjusted cameras, reporters rehearsed introductions, collectors stood shoulder to shoulder with mechanics, students, historians, and curious families. Everyone wanted to see the car that had spent decades hidden in plain sight. Ethan arrived shortly after noon, with Lily beside him. The Mustang sat on the same trailer that had carried it to the Heritage Motor Festival 30 days earlier. The difference was not the car. The difference was the crowd. 30 days ago people laughed. Today they waited in complete silence as the trailer rolled into position. Walter and Richard stood nearby answering questions from historians and journalists. Every document had been verified, every record had been reviewed. The conclusion remained unchanged. The surviving prototype was real. As the presentation began, large screens displayed photographs, engineering notes, and archival records recovered during the investigation. The audience watched carefully. Some took notes. Others simply stared. More than once, people could be seen shaking their heads in disbelief. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The cover was removed. The old Mustang stood beneath the afternoon sunlight. It was still imperfect. The paint remained weathered. Sections of the body still showed the passage of time. Ethan had never restored it into something artificial, he had preserved its history. For several seconds, nobody spoke, the crowd simply looked. Then applause began, quiet at first, then louder. Then spreading across the square until thousands of people were clapping at once. Reporters rushed to capture reactions. Historians requested interviews. Collectors discussed valuations that climbed higher with every conversation. One respected auction specialist publicly estimated that the car could command several $1 million if offered for sale. The number spread through the crowd almost instantly. Across the square, Victoria Hayes watched from behind a line of cameras. She had arrived early but stayed away from the attention. For the first time since the festival, she found herself seeing the situation differently. She no longer saw a rusted project car, she saw patience, she saw expertise. She saw a man who had endured ridicule without responding and had allowed facts to speak for themselves. As the applause continued, journalists repeatedly approached Ethan for comments. His answers remained brief. He thanked Walter, he thanked Richard, he credited the engineers who originally built the prototype. He never once spoke about being mocked, he never mentioned the laughter. That silence affected people more than any speech could have. By late afternoon, one realization had settled across the entire city. The story was never really about the car, it was about the value that everyone overlooked until somebody took the time to truly see it. The crowds were gone 3 days later. The news vans had moved on, the interviews ended. The headlines slowly gave way to newer stories. Ashford returned to normal. Ethan preferred it that way. Early Saturday morning, he stood in the garage with a cup of coffee while sunlight filtered through the windows. The prototype sat quietly in its place. For the first time in weeks, there were no cameras outside, no reporters waiting. No strangers parked across the street. Only silence. Lily sat on a stool beside the workbench, drawing pictures with colored pencils. The rabbit rested beside her. "Are you going to sell it?" she asked. Ethan looked at the car before answering. It was a question many adults had asked. Somehow, it sounded different coming from her. "I do not know," he said. Lily nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. A few hours later, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Ethan recognized the visitor immediately. Victoria Hayes stepped out alone. There were no cameras, no employees, no audience. She walked toward the garage and stopped several feet away. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Victoria looked at the car. "I came to apologize." Ethan remained quiet. Victoria folded her hands together. 30 days ago I thought I understood exactly what I was looking at." She gave a small smile. "Turns out I was wrong." Ethan glanced toward the Mustang. "A lot of people were." Victoria nodded. "That is true." She hesitated before continuing. "But most of them did not have a microphone and a crowd." Ethan almost smiled. The silence that followed felt lighter than the ones before it. Victoria looked around the garage. The tools were organized, the workbench was clean, nothing about the place suggested fame or sudden wealth. It looked exactly like the workspace of a man who simply cared about doing things properly. "You never tried to prove me wrong," she said. Ethan set down his coffee. There was nothing to prove. Victoria looked at him for several seconds and finally understood. The car had never changed, the facts had always been there. The only thing that changed was what people were willing to see. Before leaving, she shook his hand and wished him well. No speeches, no dramatic moment. Just respect. After she drove away, Lily climbed down from her stool and walked over to her father. Together they stood looking at the car. The garage was quiet again. The way Ethan liked it. Lily slipped her hand into his. "Does everyone like it now?" she asked. Ethan looked at the Mustang one last time. Then he looked at his daughter, A small smile appeared on his face. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "They finally see it." Lily nodded as if that explained everything, and maybe it did,